We've marked a total of 56 targets and our potential targets, and I've ruled out a couple of those, just sort of giving them the once over, and after doing a bit of data crunching and analysis, have determined that they are in fact geological features. So slowly plugging away, and even if we haven't found the one spot yet, we've at least ruled out where we know she isn't. So progress is progress. And Russ, there are a few different clippers during this time. How similar was the Samoan clipper to the Pacific clipper?
Let's see. Well, Pacific Clipper was later. I believe Pacific Clipper was one of the Boeing 314s, the big super clippers they called them. There were basically 3 models of aircraft that were considered flying clippers. Starting with the Sikorsky S-42, which is the type that Samoan clipper was actually a modified version of that, the S-42B, which was starting with the 8th of the 10 that were built. That was the plane that became Samoan clipper. There was also 3 Martin M130s, which were somewhat bigger than the Sikorskys and the S-42s, and with longer range and could haul more passengers, more cargo. And those were the planes that were primarily intended to make this Pacific run. The S-42s were used to conduct the initial surveys, and then ran shorter routes, like Samoan Clipper. Started life as Pan American Clipper 2, and after making the first survey run to New Zealand, it was reassigned to do the shuttle run from Manila to the Chinese mainland. So Manila to Macau, and then on to Hong Kong. But the main route taking passengers from California all the way to the Philippines was handled by the Martin M130s. Like China Clipper was the most famous one, and became kind of the shorthand for all of them. Some of them at some point, all of them kind of collectively became known as China Clippers, though there was really only one that officially went by that name. And then in the later in the 30s, like starting in 1939, they had the Boeing 314s came online, and as I mentioned earlier, those were the super clippers with, again, another order of magnitude of passenger hauling and cargo hauling and extended range, so that when they resumed the New Zealand service after the loss of Samoan Clipper, the 314s could fly longer legs and would skip Kingman Reef and Pongo Pongo and go to Canton Island and then on down to New Zealand. And they all had individual names. Some of the aircraft had their names changed several times to reflect the regions that they were flying in. But I'm pretty sure that Pacific Clipper was one of those later ones, one of the Boeing 314s.
So the clipper in the name, I mean, that's just it. It's only a part of the name to sort of symbolize the style in which the aircraft is flying.
Well, the Pan Am wanted to call to mind something that people were familiar with. So, because flying was so new, such a different way for people to travel, and people were mostly used to traveling by car or by train, or even more in line with transoceanic travel and international travel by ship. And so they wanted to call to mind the comfort and the solidity of sea travel, And then Juan Trippe wanted to also to tap into some of the romance associated with it, and the clipper ships were fast sailing merchant ships in the 19th century, and that would carry these tremendous clouds of sail, and so that they could speed on their way to Asia and pick up cargoes of tea and silks and spices and porcelain, and rush them back to markets in the West. And so they decided to dub their aircraft flying clippers to call that to mind, and reassure people that this was something familiar, and to call to mind that speed and that romance and adventure of the clipper ships of the past.
And yes, we have 4 lines to complete. Another 8 hours or so of side scans, and then at that point we'll decide whether to expand the original survey area a little bit to the west based on some records that Russ and all have looked at.
Yeah, we have we have very good position information that was established within a few hours of the loss of the airplane, and especially the presence of the oil slick that persisted over a day after the plane had been lost. And the feeling was that it meant that the source of the slick was coming from the ocean floor. So, and presumably from the wreck of Samoan Clipper. But what we don't know, and what nobody could know then as well, is what forces acted on that oil as it rose to the surface. We're in right now 3,340 meters of water, so a lot can happen in that time. If there's any sort of undersea currents that would act on that oil or that rising debris, and so that it would arrive at the surface, some distance from where it left the bottom. So we've searched a pretty large area immediately around the where the wreck was estimated to be, but the feeling is that if some forces were acting on those that rising oil, that the best indications we have is that the current was moving from west to east. So we'll track it more back to the west to see if we can find the true origin point of that oil.
And that oil slick really was sort of one of these bigger clues as to what happened, right? I mean, because when the Navy went back, they saw what they described as an oil slick sort of emanating from below the depths.
Yeah, it was just within a few hours of losing communication with the airplane. They had received reports from the northern coast of Tutuila, of the main island of American Samoa, and saying that people had spotted smoke to the northwest. So there was a Navy ship, a seaplane tender called the Avocet, that was based at the Naval Station Wharf in Pongo Pongo, and they had a scout plane assigned to them, a float plane called a Grumman J2F Duck, and it was launched within a few hours of the loss of Samoan Clipper, and searched off to the northwest, and very quickly found that there was an oil slick floating on the surface. And the Avocet was directed to get underway, and which it did that evening, and waited offshore until the sun came up on the morning of the 12th, and immediately, almost immediately after sunrise, they spotted the oil slick as well. And the aircraft overflew the site as well, starting at dawn. And Lieutenant Williamson, who was the pilot and the captain of the Avocet, but he had been over the site the day before, and when he landed, he reported that it appeared as if the oil slick was coming from the ocean floor, and we interpret that to mean that each time he saw it, it was basically in the same place, and and which would mean that if it was just a small quantity of oil, like a smear of oil that was left on the surface when the airplane impacted, it would have drifted and dissipated overnight. But clearly it hadn't. So the only explanation is that it's being replenished somehow, and the assumption is that it's from the shattered tanks of the Samoan Clipper resting on the ocean floor.
And do we know about, or do we have sort of an idea or an estimate of how long it would take something like the Samoan Clipper to sink 3,000 meters?
That is a good question, and I mean, I guess what's terminal velocity for objects falling through the water column? Throw it out to our fellow shipmates and listeners out there. I'm not sure how much the hydrodynamics of the pieces, the wreckage, how that might affect how they fall. I mean, I imagine the engines and the wing would have led the way, being the heaviest, and if the engines are on the leading edge of the wing, it would tend to maybe knife down through the water as opposed to like a big chunk of fuselage section might more flutter down like a leaf.
Sure. Yeah, because I wonder, I mean, I think at least I've been sort of visualizing it as, the Samoan Clipper is at the bottom and this oil slick is rising from the bottom, but is there potential that the oil slick, the oil could have been rising as the Clipper was sinking?
Oh, I imagine that certainly within an hour or two, the wreckage would have been on the seabed. I don't think it would have been floating still like in the water column and drifting with the current itself.
So someone just wrote in, Megan did say this morning that it depends on shape.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and I think they've done calculations for, say, like Titanic, like how long that wreckage took to reach the bottom. But I just off the top of my head can't recall what value was given for that.
Do we know how much it weighed?
I think overall about 20,000 pounds or 10 tons.
What do we know, sort of by comparison, what a plane of similar size today might weigh? I mean, they're made out of different materials, right?
Yeah,
Roughly?
modern aircraft would probably have a lot of composite materials.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, though, aluminum is still a favored construction material, especially for smaller transport aircraft. Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder what the most comparable in like size and performance, what it would be for the present day. I mean, nobody builds flying boats that size any longer. There are still manufacturers making amphibians anyway, like aircraft that can land on the sea and are on water and on land. But nobody, I believe, is really making pure flying boats.
Right, and so when we're talking about the flying boat, it is very different than float planes of today even, right? I mean, so float planes are on these pontoons, but the bottom of the plane is still elevated above the surface of the water.
Yeah, more typically you'll see that, like the plane will be resting on floats or and not having the fuselage of the airplane actually also serving as the hull of the boat. you know, I think it's probably a matter of scale. You know, at some point you can't build like pontoons big enough to
Yeah.
support it. So you might as well make the airplane, you know, incorporate it right into the airplane. You know, at one point the Navy, after World War II, experimented with jet flying boats, but I think they just found that it was more trouble than it was worth. You know, they had developed the aircraft carriers so far, and land-based airplanes, land-based facilities were so good, and you know, in-flight refueling. So you didn't have the need to you know, have an aircraft that could you know, turn any you know, bay or river or lake into a landing field. You could bring it from farther away, or there'd be, you know, serviceable runways and things closer to your area of operation. So and it gave a lot of trouble. They had to, you know, mount the engines kind of on top of the wings so that the jet intakes wouldn't swallow water, you know, on the takeoff run. And yeah, it just seemed like it was again more trouble than it was worth to try and maintain that technology. So they moved on.
A jet flying boat. That would
Yes.
be sort of like the ones in Florida. I see like the jet boats of Florida.
Right.
Is that, wow. All right, so here's a question kind of on that same vein. I'm not sure if we will be able to answer it, but it does say, judging by the weight of Argus compared with the weight of the Clipper, can we make an estimate sort of comparing the two in the amount of time that it would take for both to reach the bottom? So we don't really know how long it would have taken the Samoan Clipper necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question for the you know, the Argus pilot. Did when we launched, did the vehicle just descend with gravity, or was there any kind of, you know, thruster assist for that?
Our limiting factor going down is the payout speed on the winch, because Argus would sink like a rock, but our limiting speed is how fast the winch is comfortable paying out cable.
Right.
But it would be hard, to the viewer's question, it'd be really hard to draw parallels between Argus and the Clipper because of the hydrodynamics of the two. That's going to be the major player versus weight. So a small, light object may fall faster than a big, heavy object if the small object is sharp and pointy and has not much drag, versus the big, heavy object, which may, like a wing shape, for example, might not fall as straight as a rock. A good solid rock, you know. The rock will go straight down, and the wing might drift off a little bit left and right, or have more drag, or especially if there's explosion-y bits nearby, like who knows, right?
Right.
But the Samoan Clipper wouldn't have a winch payout limitations. There's that.
And currently it does take about between 4 and 8 hours to get Argus to the depth that it's at currently, depending on, you know, a variety of circumstances.
I think the 8-hour estimate was the outside time it would take if we needed to recover the vehicle and Argus, and then reincorporate Hercules and launch them both back into the water.
Together.
So
Yeah, the 8 hours the turnaround time on deck. Plus there would also be the ascent and descent. Ascent with just Argus matches the descent at about 25 meters a minute. And that's about the same with Herc with the descent, but if you have the two vehicles on the ascent, that's the slowest of all, and that goes at about 15 meters a minute.
So when we launched Argus, how long did it take us to reach the bottom?
Well, maybe this is an exercise for viewers at home. 3,000 meters, 25 meters a minute. Plus some, of course, launch time, some deck logistics and handovers and equipment testing right at the top, so add another 15 minutes for that. Ready for the answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
2 hours.
2 whole hours.
hopefully that gave viewers enough time to try it themselves.
I didn't see.
Also, we can safely say it took less than 2 hours for the wreckage to settle to the bottom.
Maybe.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know if I'd fully completely buy that.
Really?
I'd say
Okay.
likely,
Right.
but I think that the hydrodynamics play a huge role in that.
Sure.
It would probably also depend on the wings being intact. Huh?
Absolutely.
And would the fuel add buoyancy?
Yeah, there would have been, you know, perhaps some fuel in the wing tanks, but they were in the process of dumping it. So then you don't know how much, you know, what was the damage done by the explosion, but the explosion most likely occurred in the hull-mounted tanks. So how that affected the wing, we don't really know.
Yeah, I guess a good way to think about it is, just imagine you're standing on top of a building and you drop a marble off. It'll take, you know, so much time to fall to the bottom. And then you drop a quilt off the top. They'll of course accelerate the same in a vacuum, blah, blah, but the aerodynamics comes into play quite a lot with the quilt, but less so with the marble. So maybe the quilt is heavier, but who's to say which one's gonna fall faster? You have to try it out. And you can't neglect how the air plays on that quilt. Is it gonna catch it and form a big kind of hot air balloon shape and make it float and flutter? Or is the marble's gonna fall straight down? Theoretically, the quilt would have a faster terminal velocity, being heavier, but maybe not with the aerodynamics, or in the water, the hydrodynamics.
How much of being an ROV pilot is physics versus engineering versus other disciplines? Is it a little bit of everything?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a little bit of everything. I mean, the physics sort of helps you understand the concepts and what's going on really on a smaller level almost, whereas engineering is how you actually apply the physics. So I guess I look at it that way. But being able to understand the entire system of what's going on is definitely important. So both having the physics knowledge of why the things are happening, and then the application and the engineering of how to make it happen, I think it's both important.
And then speaking of all of these different variables that might have affected the way in which the Samoan Clipper fell, how do they affect our surveys? Do thermal layers have an impact on side scan sonar, or salinity, or other sort of conditions at the bottom of the ocean?
I do not believe that temperature per se has an effect on sound waves. I'm sure it does to a certain extent, but not that I've seen in a sonar record. Salinity, that's a good question. I'm not sure either. I have never surveyed in fresh water, so I don't know. That's an excellent question, though, and I'm sure that has to do with how sound travels underwater. And I'm sure that's more of a physics question beyond my knowledge base.
Yeah, I think the sound speed would definitely play a role in how accurate your data would be. I think that's why they occasionally use something called an XBT, which is a expendable bathymetric temperature thermograph, which is actual scientists use occasionally to measure sound speed through the water column. And you can drop them off of a ship and get that data real time.
So there are ways to sort of account for those different variables in the data as we collect it.
Yes, potentially.
I imagine that since our height above the bottom is only about 15 meters, probably there's not going to be any effect from any thermocline at that in just that short amount of space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for something towing on the bottom like this, probably not as much as the hull-mounted mounting beams, multi-beam systems that have a much larger distance to travel. So I know they do collect, sea surface and salinity and all of that. Then that can be put into the processing.
And just to update some of you, you've been asking, we are on line 18 of 21 planned lines. We spent most of the night transiting from the southern area of our survey up to the northern part. And at this point, we have 56 marked potential targets. So after we finish up these next 4 planned lines, our team will decide whether to expand the original survey area and do some sonar surveys to the west based on some historical information and logging that we've looked at. Do we have sort of an idea of when we might be diving to these potential targets?
I don't think we've determined when or how we're going to use Argus at this point with its camera system, or we do not have any targets at this point that we're going to put Hercules down on yet. So to be determined, so check back, I think, after this survey area is complete and see what our next steps are going to be. So that'll probably be 8 hours, give or take. Probably more like 10 with the turns factored in.
Hey, Sam.
Hello, 8 to 12.
Hello.
This is Samantha Wishneck sitting in as video engineer.
Hi, Sam.
Hi, video.
Hi, everyone. No. So what's been happening at 8 to 12?
Oh, you know.
You know, side scan.
Yeah, we've just been waiting for you.
Aww.
Tractoring along.
Tractoring. Lawnmowering. Lawnmowering.
Is tractoring the new phrase for describing what we're doing?
It's equally applicable.
Okay. I like it. Plowing. Okay.
We're on line 18 of the 21 original planned lines in our survey. So we're up in the north now, and there will be 3 more after we complete this one, and then at that point we'll decide what to do next. More likely to expand our search area out to the west.
Excellent. And why to the west, Russ?
Well, because reviewing the archival data, the position information that we were given, is very precise in latitude, but less so in longitude. The longitude value only appears in degrees and minutes. So the feeling is that that may have been more of a rough estimate for them, and so we would want to emphasize like the east-west directions, and that since the currents, all the evidence we have is that at the time the currents were running towards the northeast or the east. The only debris we know that was picked up after the January 12th washed up on an island due east of here about 8 days later. So the feeling is that if we're going to track back towards the origin point, that it would more likely be off to the west.
So there's one eyewitness account, and do we know where that person was when they reported seeing the Samoan clipper? And
she reported that she was in her boat making her way from Fangasa Bay to Asu. So Fangasa Bay is the other side of the mountain from Pongo Pongo on the north coast of Tutuila. And Asu is west down the coast. And she said she had just cleared the mouth of the bay, and then was headed basically west when the airplane flew low overhead in the direction of Apia, which is to the west as well. And then it made a wide turn out to sea, which is to the north, and then dove quickly towards the surface and appeared to almost to be landing when there was a flash and the sound of something that she described like a gunshot, the report of a detonation, and then a large quantity of black smoke and the wings floating at the surface for about 5 minutes before they disappear. So yeah, so she was basically just the other side of Pongo Pongo and maybe a little bit towards towards the west. But we still don't know her name. She's still just the witness or the eyewitness. They did not give her full name in the report. Presumably she lived in Fangasa, because it sounded like she was going to visit somebody in Asu. And we heard some of the crew met somebody locally who works at, I believe the correct name is Teasa's, and said that there had been a woman who's since passed away, but used to tell stories of how the airplane went down, and she would point from the door of her house out to sea. So perhaps that was her, and we unfortunately missed our chance to get to talk to her. But maybe that story lives on in her family and people listening in from American Samoa. Maybe they'll ask around and of their family or their friends and their families and see if we can put a name to that person, that very important person from the report from 81 years ago.
And we did have a couple of listeners or viewers from American Samoa earlier, so talofa, and if you heard that,
yes,
spread the word. Let us know. And have we looked, sort of going off of that notion of, we know the area that this eyewitness was in, and we know based on the Bureau of Air Commerce report where they believed that the aircraft went down. Have we scanned over this reported down site?
Yeah, we I think the value they gave was working off the top of my head. I think they said it was 10.5 miles from Fangasa Bay, and on the first night, our navigators drew a line from Fangasa Bay and out to you know, 10.5 miles, and it fell right in our search box. So, you know, and I think, you know, some of these may be, you know, just estimates based on the position where they had estimated that the plane had gone down, and then calculated back to, you know, where the witness was, you know, reported to be.
And did we find anything of interest in that general area, or not so much?
Well, nothing interesting enough to prompt us to investigate it, you know, right away. I'm not sure how many of our targets, our potential targets, lined up with that general area. It would have been in kind of the northeast corner of the search box. So I don't know, if we back out on the high pack, maybe we can see where that. No, there's so many. There's a lot of writing in there now.
Yeah, what target are you looking for?
I think there was something that was supposed to be, you know, 10.5 miles from
Yes.
from Pangasa Bay.
Here it is, down in.
Oh, okay, so yeah, we've definitely been over that area then.
Yeah, that was out on a turn.
Right.
And those are all of the black letterings. Those are all of our marked potential targets.
Yes, plus some line numbering and random sort of navigational points that the navigators have used to talk with the mates.
It's a lot busier than it was 2 days ago, that's for sure. And so we are operating at about 15 meters above the seafloor. And then, so you can see on this top right quadrant, that's our Argus cam. And then in the top left, that's our side scan sonar surveys. And Dee Dee, they're two separate frequencies, right? That we're seeing?
Yes, so the side scan sonar is broadcasting at 2 frequencies. The top is a higher frequency at 600 kilohertz, and the lower that you're seeing is 300 kilohertz. So they have different abilities for range as far as how far they can see. So they're just sort of 2 options for looking at potentially the same territory.
And then there is that sort of black void area right down the middle, but we're compensating for that by using Argus cam.
Yes, so the black area down the center is our blind spot, our dead space, where there is no acoustic data. Since the transducers are mounted slightly sending a diagonal signal down to the seafloor, directly under us, there is no information received. So it's black, but the camera mounted on Argus in the top right of your screen is compensating for that, and also providing some interesting images of the seafloor to compare with the acoustic signal that's coming back.
And so that sort of gives us these 2 ways to see the bottom of the ocean, right? I mean, there's the potential to find the Samoan clipper or some, you know, object that doesn't look natural in these sonar surveys, but then also we can literally see the bottom of the seafloor using the Argus cam.
Yes, so unfortunately the field of view is much smaller with camera systems, so if we were to only use a camera system, the lines would be much, much tighter together, and it would take a lot more longer survey time. So the side scan allows a greater reach, a greater field of view to try to maximize our time out here.
And we had an interesting conversation one of these shifts, I'm not even going to try and remember which one it was, about Argo, which was the ROV, that was used to find the Titanic. And Argo was equipped with only the video capability, right? So it was a much smaller survey, or not necessarily a smaller survey area, but the lines were much closer together.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with exactly the capabilities of that, but yeah, that was a towed camera system that ended up finding the Titanic based upon the debris field. As most people know, the debris field is fairly large from the Titanic, so once they picked up some objects, they followed that debris trail back to the main wreckage. And that's one of the things that we're also looking at too, is if we see anything that appears to be man-made material in the Argus cameras, we're going to be extremely excited and try to then possibly modify our survey to trace that debris trail back to its source.
And in terms of debris field, this was a mail carrier, so we know that there were a little over 750 pounds of cargo on board. What other sorts of, I mean, not necessarily that we would be spotting that, but what other sorts of things from the aircraft would maybe make up this debris field?
Yeah, I think it's mainly going to be structural, pieces of the fuselage, and the wing, the tail, the cockpit section. Simone Clipper didn't have as much in the way of interior fixtures because it was modified specifically for long-range survey flights and for hauling express cargo. So the D compartment, the compartment directly beneath the wing, was entirely filled with auxiliary fuel tanks, 6 oval-shaped 225-gallon tanks, and that's where the explosion occurred. So that would be the most devastated section of the airplane, and you might just find some smaller pieces of the aluminum that made up those tanks and the structural sections of the fuselage, and perhaps some of the kind of the piping and that connected piping and hoses that connected the fuel system to the overhead tanks in the wing. There were a few bunks still remaining, with the plane as it would be in sleeper configuration, and so a couple of bunks for the crew to be able to rest when they're off duty, and a few seating, sitting chairs, but not as lavishly appointed as the airliner version. And then in the tail, you had that was the mail stowage, and there'd be actually kind of a ladder or a very steep set of stairs that descends from the back of the airplane. There was a hatch in the top of the fuselage, and the passengers would board by climbing a set of stairs along the dock and then stepping onto the airplane and walking down essentially through the ceiling. So that ladder, potentially, but potentially the entire tail section as a piece together. The doors, the bulkhead doors, moving forward from the fuel compartment, there was a navigator station. So, which again, most of the items picked up in the debris fields or in the floating debris were reportedly from the navigator's compartment. So, navigational instruments, sections of the table, crew chairs from their positions, the flight engineers' instruments, the radio operator, and all the communications gear. The cockpit, could conceivably be as a unit, as a piece, but the forward of that include, so you've got the pilot seats and the flight controls, and then forward of that in the bow, there was actually an anchor and a windlass inside the airplane in case they were forced to land, off airport or away from a port facility, and needed to anchor up and wait for better weather or make repairs or whatever it might be. But so yeah, so you actually have what amounts to a boat anchor and windlass and the line to hold the airplane. So a real variety of things that could conceivably mark the trail back to the main wreck.
And one thing that that sort of piqued the interest of a lot of listeners was this notion that there was some film on board. And Megan may have a little bit more to say, sort of, if you're listening, about how well we might expect something like that to be preserved, as well as these hundreds of pounds of mail.
Yeah, I read an article in some of the New Zealand papers prior to the accident were actually reporting on the items that they were awaiting arrival in Auckland. So in addition to the mail and the letters and commemorative envelopes and things, there were a few items: a typewriter, a new radio set, and these 3 reels of news footage, film story of the sinking of the U.S. Gunboat USS Panay on the Yangtze River in China, outside of what was then Nanking. That had only happened, a few weeks earlier, and so they were getting this, anticipating getting the images of this news story carried there on the Simone Clipper in as part of the first air cargo shipment, but it never made it. So perhaps those reels and those film cans, those metal film cans, are still down there somewhere.
How incredible would it be to now, 81 years later, maybe be the recipient of some of that mail?
Right. And we do know it's not unprecedented. There was some salvage work being carried out on a ship called I believe the Garasopa, off the coast of England, that had been torpedoed in World War II, and the crew, they were there primarily, I believe, to recover the cargo of silver, but they grabbed as well this bag that, when it reached the surface, actually turned out to contain letters. It was a Royal Mail shipment, and I believe that collection ended up with the Royal Mail Museum, and they have conserved a number of them and put them on display, and it makes a especially moving tribute there, because it's correspondence and mail sent by people in wartime that never reached its intended recipients.
And we had a viewer ask, was an explosion witnessed, or is our assumption of where the aircraft may be resting today based on recovered debris? And it is a little bit of both, right? I mean, the historical records indicate both a debris field that was discovered following an eyewitness account that was given before word even got out about the incident.
Yes, exactly that. It's a combination of both. So there was a witness who came forward who reported seeing the airplane dive for the water, and then some kind of explosion and fire right at the surface, and that information jived very well with the evidence collected at the scene, where the small bits of floating debris that was found, much of it was charred or had been exposed to heat, and so the feeling, and given that they knew that the last report, the airplane was going to be dumping fuel, which there's a very great fire risk associated with that. So all of those pieces of the puzzle fit together very well to paint that, to present that picture of what happened. So their estimations were based on all of those those lines of evidence. So we haven't talked for a while about Ed Musick, the pilot of Samoan Clipper. He is really a today, unfortunately, unsung hero of the early days of aviation. He already had a 25-year career by the time Samoan Clipper was lost in 1938. Had flown over 1 million miles at a time when most people on the planet had hardly seen an airplane, much less been up in one. The first air show ever held in the United States was at Dominguez Field in Los Angeles in 1910. Barely 7 years after the first powered flight. And in the audience of that show was a 16-year-old Ed Musick. And he was enamored of flight and wanted the opportunity to take part in that. And of course, the airplanes and the ability to fly, it was a very expensive pursuit, way too much for a young kid making his way as a auto mechanic. But he and his friends were determined. They knew they wanted to fly and decided that the only way they were going to get the chance was if they built their own airplane, which they did, and wrecked it almost immediately. Built another one, wrecked that, and then ultimately got work at the Curtiss factory and earned enough money to start taking lessons, and Ed was flying full time by about 1913, 1914. Spent some time as an air show performer, doing stunts, and one time over a kind of a fair in Venice, California, was hired to shoot fireworks from the back of a flying plane, and his assistant had a little accident and ended up setting the wing of the plane on fire. A plane that would have been made entirely of wood and or almost entirely of wood and very highly flammable doped fabric. Musick was able to force land the airplane, and the two of them escaped. So he was very nearly lost his life in an in-flight fire long before Simone Clipper. But after that experience, he was done with demonstration and stunt flying. But World War I, he joined the Marines, but was not permitted to go to France and serve in combat. He was considered way too valuable for his experience as a flyer, and they needed instructors. And who else was more experienced at that time? Hardly anyone. So music was kept here or not here. We're out in the Pacific, but he was kept in the United States, training the pilots who would serve overseas. And afterwards, worked a lot of jobs. Always keeping a hand in aviation. Worked for a succession of companies as different outfits tried to get their operations going, establish regular passenger flying or mail flying. Interesting that one of the lines that he worked for had seasonal routes that in the winters they would make flights to the Caribbean, and in the summers they would operate on the Great Lakes, flying people into Canada. And it's maybe no coincidence that at that time, which happened to be during Prohibition, that they were flying short hop routes to visit places where people could legally take a drink. But he spent some time, I think, working with the Anthony Fokker and his U.S. operation, which was building the Fokker trimotor, which was one of the more successful early airliners, and gained a lot of experience there, and flew with another company called Aero Marine, but until finally landing in 1927 with the fledgling Pan American Airways. And it was a match made in heaven. This was, Juan Trippe had founded the company with a intention to pursue a route where they would become the international airline and would go after mail contracts to subsidize their operations and make them profitable. And Music was brought on as pilot number one, and was quickly made chief pilot as the company grew and expanded its routes, and Music would help plan those routes and then train up the pilots and develop the techniques and the technology to start flying longer and longer routes and over always over water, or almost always over water, as they expanded throughout the islands of the Caribbean and down to Latin America, and really inventing the air transport industry as we have come to know it. So developing new techniques, new level of professionalism. Things like weather reporting, having their own dedicated weather reporting stations in every area that they operated, so they could plan accordingly to avoid rough weather wherever possible, and developing their blind flying techniques and radio communications and navigation. Pan Am would fund a lot of research into making radio sets smaller and but still powerful, and where they could be carried on aircraft and keep contact with the rest of with their home bases, and use radio direction finding to hone their ability to find small islands. Became especially crucial when they tackled the Pacific, and they were crossing these vast distances and aiming at very, very small targets. And So he was the one. He was the trailblazer, the one who led the way, and was the obvious pick when they